Hello everyone, welcome to part 2 of our weekly videos on administrative decisions. In this video, we'll be looking at two important topics. The first is who makes administrative decisions, and the second being how does automation affect the way that government decisions are made, and how is it likely to affect those decisions in the future. So to start off with, let's think about who is actually making decisions. When we talk about government decision making in this unit, we often tend to sort of think a bit about it in a fairly anonymous or faceless context. We think about the government, the executive power manifesting, without really considering that it's actually people that have to make these decisions on behalf of the government. And so in this topic, we'll be sort of taking a bit of a closer look at, who are the people who make government decisions and who are the people who wield this executive power. So in our system of Westminster-inspired governance, the sort of peak of executive power is held by ministers. So these are people who sit at the top of the hierarchy of a government department. So, for example, the Department of Health, you've got a whole range of bureaucrats and public servants, and then at the top is the health minister, and they're responsible for everything that happens in that department. And so, notionally, it's that minister who's making all the decisions related to health. Of course, in practice, it would be impossible for one person to make every administrative decision on a particular issue or for a particular department. So we need to have a system of delegating and spreading out authority while still retaining the advantage of that system, which is that by having someone who's very clearly responsible and identifiable, that's how we can hold the government to account. We can point to this person made this decision. Therefore, if there's a problem with that decision, this is the person that we need to be speaking to, challenging and moving forward in that manner. So it's the way that we sort of share power out within a government department is not quite as straightforward as what I'll be presenting in this slide. The reality is a little bit more complex. It is a little bit more mutable. But for our purposes of understanding how decision-making actually works, these sort of four categories that I'll be presenting are a good enough understanding of how things will work. So at sort of the top, or the first category, is the principal. So this is the person who's nominated in legislation as the authorized decision maker. So this will usually be the minister. And if it's not the minister, it will be some other key person who heads up the department. So, for example, the Commissioner of Taxation is authorized by the various taxation acts to make decisions for the ATO. Similarly, secretaries, some boards of government corporations, these are the people who legislation identifies clearly as this person has authority to make these decisions under the Act. The next step down from that is what we would call a delegate. And so this is a person who has specifically been delegated authority by the principal. So this usually has to be in writing. It usually also occurs with the express permission of the Act. So you'll have the provision giving the principal authority. You'll also have what's called a deeming provision, which allows the principal to delegate authority to other individuals. And so this is really the key. Most administrative decisions are made by people with delegated authority. And there's no problem with that. It's just the practical reality of the situation. But the decisions of a delegate are treated as if the principal themselves had made that decision. Similarly, we've got agents. So these are people who act as an agent for the principal or the delegate in situations of practical administrative necessity. So this is a scenario where they might not have express permission from the principal or the delegate to act, but they're conducting or exercising authority. They're making decisions in a way that is just necessary based on the circumstances. So, for example, the use of a signature going out on a routine notice of assessment. That's the kind of thing that there's nothing really complex or controversial about it. Just the sheer volume of notices of assessment that the tax office sends out means that it will be certainly impossible for the principal, but even very difficult for the delegates to do it all. So practical necessity means that for something that is straightforward and not complex, an agent can act out of practical administrative necessity. And lastly, we've got an administrative assistant. This is a little bit trickier. So basically, this is a person who's providing assistance to the principal or the delegate to make their decisions. So, for example, they might conduct research. They might interview a person who's going to be affected by a decision. They might take notes. They might do field work. All important things that go towards an administrative decision. Sometimes they themselves will be empowered to make decisions, but sometimes they won't. And it's a little bit of a grey area. And as a general rule, the more complex the decision that's been made, the less likely it is that it will be acceptable for an administrative assistant to have made it. So if it is something straightforward and routine, an administrative assistant might be fine. If it is something that is more complex or more technical, we would expect that you would need the principal or the delegate to be going ahead and making that decision. So an interesting distinction there. Where these ideas start to blur and become even more complicated is in the context of automated decisions. And this is a progressing area of law, especially for administrative law, but it's one that's only going to become more important in the coming years. So it is important that you're across this and aware of this. So we think about automated decisions as being decisions that are made with little or no human input. So decisions that are made by computers or artificial intelligence. At the moment, these are typically rule-based. And what I mean by that is that there is a set of programs set up that identify, sort of like a decision tree, identify different scenarios, and the program is told what to do and how to react under certain circumstances. So a really good example here is in the field of tax. Obviously, there are huge numbers of tax returns going through the system every year. The tax office has systems set up and programs set up that it uses to pull out returns that it would like to take a closer look at and perhaps audit with a finer eye to detail. So, for example, they've got formulas that they would use to calculate roughly what they would expect someone's expenses to be. So, I've seen cases where they've got formulas for about how much paint a painter would go through in a given year, proportionate to the amount of income that they've got. So, you did this much business as a painter, you would expect to have used X amount of paint, and therefore your expenses, give or take, it's a range, you would expect paint expenses to fall within a particular range. What the computer program does is it's set up, if you tick, primary occupation painter, that triggers the system to look at what are the expenses, what's the ratio of expenses to income. If it's outside that range, the system is programmed to flag that and then it pops up, and then a human auditor can take a closer look, identify if there is indeed a discrepancy, and if so, why that might arise, and then that can lead to, potentially there's a problem with that expense, things have been overclaimed, and they go through the process that way. But what's important is that initial kind of review of all painters' tax returns, it would be impossible for a human to go through all that. But the computer is able to do it really, really quickly and effectively. And the automation process flags the few returns that need to be looked at more closely by a human. You can probably already guess that there are some potential problems with this kind of rule-based automated system. Obviously, if the program is set up incorrectly, if the range that it's looking to identify, let's say, if that's out, then obviously everything that flows from that is going to be problematic as well. You can have problems when there's incorrect inputs. So, that could be as something as simple as someone who's accidentally, missed a decimal place or something. And so the data that's going into the program is wrong. So then, of course, all the rules that it's following within the system and the output that it produces, that's also going to be wrong. Thirdly, you can have problems with interpretation. So the human element of looking at whatever the program has spat out at the end. So to use the painting example, what it is designed to do is just identify returns that need to be more closely looked at. There might be completely fine and entirely innocent explanations why someone's expenses fall outside the range that the tax office has identified. And the expectation would be that it's the human ATO auditor going through and working that out and making that decision. If they didn't do that, if they just assumed, oh, well, the computer's identified this as a problem, so it's a problem, then that's an incorrect interpretation of what the program is actually doing. So there's huge scope. Well, there are plenty of opportunities for problems to arise at various stages in the process. What that means is that potentially where we've got decision-making relying on an automated decision, then we're going to have an incorrect decision. We're going to have problems that might need to lead to a judicial review. And so that leads us to a really interesting and thorny question about whether an automated decision, a decision by a computer program rather than a human, whether that's an administrative decision that can be reviewed under the system. And it's an area that we have an answer on at law at the moment, but it's also one that I think is going to be revisited in the coming years and decades. And certainly it's going to be something that is going to develop as these computer systems do become more sophisticated. At the moment, the base presumption is that an automated decision is not reviewable because it lacks the sort of human or mental engagement with the issue to be considered a decision that's final, substantive, determinative, those sorts of ideas that we talked about in the previous video. Instead, an automated decision is usually treated more akin to an intermediate decision, just something that happens along the way. But the exception is where a deeming provision applies. So just as we talked about, authority can be delegated to delegates or agents. If a provision in the Act allows for automated decision-making and provides that an automated decision is treated as a decision of the delegate or the principal, then that might be reviewable. So to return to the painting example again, the identification of a person in the system as having expenses outside what they would expect, that's not the final decision, right? That's just flagging it to the auditors to take a closer look at. And so when we think about the sort of characteristics of a decision that we talked about in the previous video, it's not final, it's intermediate, and it doesn't necessarily have a substantive impact on someone's rights. What would is the later audit, and if they decided the expenses were too high, that would be a decision that would be reviewable, but it's also, at that point being made by a human. The initial flagging in the computer system, the automated part, not really reviewable. We can contrast that with, you might be familiar with the Robodebt example that we talked about in the previous week. Those were automated decisions that were treated under the Act as decisions by the Secretary. So they were deemed to be final decisions. Now, the Robodebt example is a little bit tricky because the issue wasn't necessarily with the decision itself. The issue was with the way that the debts were calculated. The calculation was wrong because it used an average of income, and so it's not really relevant for our purposes here, to the extent that the issue wasn't, it was a computer making the calculation rather than a human. The issue was with the formula itself. But as a contrast to the painting example, the Robodebt decisions were reviewable because of those deeming provisions and because they were treated as a final substantive determinative decision under the Act. So, and as I said, I think this is an area that is going to need more work and is going to be looked at more closely by the courts in the future, because we would expect that the trend to be an increase in the use of technology in administrative decisions. We are going to see increased automation in government decision-making and interactions between citizens and governments. In the last decade alone, we've seen a huge increase in, for example, the implementation of MyGov and the increasing number of services that get rolled into that system. COVID as well sparked a big increase in doing things online rather than in person or via hard copy. And these will all rely on automation and will increasingly do so. On the technological side of things, we're also, of course, going to see advances in artificial intelligence, machine learning, these kinds of things. This is significant because at the moment, administrative or automated decision-making programs rely on a human programmer to tell it what the rules are, right? So you actually need someone to go in and give it the code. If this happens, then that should happen. Or if this gets inputted, then that should be the output. What we're increasingly going to see in the coming years is a rise in the ability of computers to learn the rules for themselves. So you don't actually need someone to program or tell them, input what the rules are. You just feed the computer a ton of data and then it will figure out the rules for itself, which is potentially advantageous because, for one, it removes errors in programming bias or problems with the programming, and it's more efficient. But the risk is that the computer learns the rules incorrectly, right? No matter where you are in your studies of your law degree, you would know that law is a complex and nuanced field. We're going to see that really closely in the coming weeks in administrative law. This is not a unit that would be very easy for a computer to pick up and learn the nuances and the complexities. So there's a risk that automated machine learning arrives at the wrong conclusion. So that's something that I think is inevitable, right? There's going to be a point where there will be an increase in this machine learning and inputting, but it's something that we're going to have to look at very closely and keep an eye on. And so there's going to be a lot of heavy work for administrative lawyers in the years and decades to come, making sure that these systems do strike the right balance, are still held accountable for the decisions that they reach. And lastly, in general, we're also seeing a rise in the automation of court proceedings, filings, directions, these kinds of things, not directly exclusive to administrative law, but in the context of administrative law reviews, this general automation of the court process obviously has an impact as well. So that's something to keep an eye on too. That takes us to the end of the week 2 lecture videos. Thanks very much for watching.